Hello, this is Elizabeth Clare Brewington with Discover Brightside, where we discover new things and new topics for you. And today I am with someone who I know many of you are very familiar with. You've met Lester Patrick. Thank you for your service, Lester. And this book is one of my favorite books, and I read it many times because every time I read this book, it's his memoir, something new comes to me. And recently, I'm not sure if many of you have heard, but every time I watch the news, Jim Crow seems to be coming up over and over again on the Senate floor, on the House. It comes up on all the major TV and radio stations. And many of you may not know about the Jim Crow era. But Lester has lived through it, and I did not know about it until I read his book. And so I think it's really important to make you aware of how dangerous this time that we're living in. So, Lester, tell me about your story and how you wrote your first book, and then we'll go into Jim Crow in a bit. But share your story with us.
Sure. First of all, thanks for the invitation, Claire, to talk about this subject, because as you said, it is what I wrote about in my first book, Start Unapologetic Present. It's a journey through Jim Crow, the information age, to God. And one of the primary reasons that I wrote about Jim Crow is because from my childhood, it was what I knew. It was what I knew. I was raised in the midst of Jim Crow, even though my parents did all they could to try to protect me from some of the laws of Jim Crow. So I experienced it throughout my life. And as I point out in the book, Jim Crow was legalized segregation. It was legalized segregation at the state and local level. It was in effect until 1965, and it was abolished by the Civil Rights Act of 1965. But in reality, it didn't stop there because people continued to practice the policies of Jim Crow, which is one of the primary reasons that I wrote about Jim Crow, because it continued throughout my life. Wherever I was able to see traces of Jim Crow. And as time permits, today, hopefully I'll be able to share some of those things that a lot of people I'm sure, are not aware of and should be aware of. And one last point about why I wrote the book about Jim Crow. We're only 59 years from the time when Jim Crow was legal. Only 59 years, because it was just abolished in 1965. And as I said, they did not go away with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1965, because there are still remnants of Jim Crow policies throughout the country. There are even remnants of Jim Crow in the U.S. Constitution and in most state constitutions, which I talk about in this book.
Yes. So talking about the book is called Start Unapologetic Present by Lester Patrick. The book is available in most places that books are sold, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and he also has a website that has an audio book that is second to none. So if you're not a reader and you just want to listen to the book being read to you, it's a really good audio recording, and you could listen to it anywhere in your car or wherever you want to listen to. So that's where the book is available. So let's dive in, and let's just tell our readers what was it like to live through the Jim Crow times, and then let's talk about why we don't want to get back there, and then the threat that we might. So stay tuned and tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I cover in the book the weak start that I had early in my life. I won't go into any level of detail, but just that I did have a very weak start. And some of it was due to Jim Crow practices. I talk about some of the experiences that I had living under Jim Crow and some of the Jim Crow laws. And real quick, one of the things that I wrote about in the book, I called this section slave work for Black youth, summer slave work for Black youth. And what I meant by that was at the time that I came up under Jim Crow, North Carolina was the tobacco capital of the world. So the only type of work that teenagers could get during the summer was working in the tobacco field. And I go into details about the conditions working under Jim Crow in the tobacco fields, because they represented the exact same work that my foreparents did, who were slaves, and in some of the same fields. And I talk about those kinds of things, going to plantations where I was able to see, for example, the beds that the slaves slept in the slave quarters, as if they had just left them there, had just got up and left and never came back.
Yeah.
So I talk about all of those things, but I'll share briefly about my experience working in the tobacco fields. There was an unwritten policy, for example, that employers in the local area would not interfere with farmers' ability to harvest tobacco. So I could be hired as a young person out of high school during the summer on a particular job, but as soon as it was time for tobacco to be harvested, I would be laid off. And this was a very, very difficult thing to really believe until this particular summer. I had been hired to work on a project along with 2 or 3 other people at the East Carolina University. And when it came time to the harvest tobacco, we were laid off. And that happened in several situations that showed me that there was, in fact, that unofficial policy by which there was no interference with putting in tobacco. So it didn't matter how well of an employee you were at that given time. When it came time to put in tobacco, you were laid off.
Wow. That is so what's going on right now. A lot of
Yes.
people are getting laid off, and we know, even though it's unofficially announced, that a lot of the layoffs are people of color, and for no fault of their own. We know this also, even when there's an interview and a selection has to be made, most oftenly people of color are not selected.
Right.
If there's a choice. And there's research to prove it as well. It's not just me talking about it. We hear this all the time. Now, this was very important to you because you actually took the time to put this in your book. So it was a big part of your memoir, enough for you to, have the courage to write about it, because many people would skip it and not want to talk about it, but it was important enough to be in your book, and a significant part of your book. So tell us why you wanted it in your book and you wanted readers to read about it.
A lot of things we take, a lot of freedoms we take for granted today. We take for granted. And we do that because there are so many people. I think people fall into a couple of categories. There are those people like me who may have experienced Jim Crow and who just want to put it behind them, which I do too, so they don't talk about it. They don't tell their children about it. They don't share any of their experiences as it relates, because in many cases it's too painful for people to share. And then there are those who are simply ignorant of the history, because
Mm-hmm.
there have been special efforts to prevent this from being known on a wide scale. But I felt that it was really important that I share my experience, and that I help some people to understand the importance of freedom, as well as their responsibilities to a democracy as citizens. And I'll talk about that more, but I would share that this Jim Crow was, I guess, for lack of a better term, I'll say was a phase that started with slave codes way back in 1770. Well, they started when the first Africans were brought to the United States around 1619. The slave codes, and these slave codes basically restricted the rights of these Africans. They existed in the 13 original colonies. They existed on an individual basis because they were not states at that time. They were not the United States. And then the slave codes, I'll give you an example of one of the slave codes. One of the slave codes, for example, prevented people or Africans from moving from one plantation to another without having a pass, talking rather too loudly in public, and in some cases, depending upon the state, forming a crowd without permission. And without permission basically meant that there was not a white person present. But then the 13th Amendment freed the slaves in the South in 1863. And this came about as a result, of course, of those Black slave codes. But the states quickly implemented the Black codes. The Black codes in the southern states, and the Black codes basically were passed after emancipation of the slaves, that resulted in some of the slaves being incarcerated and losing their freedom. For example, one of the slave, not slave, but one of the Black codes stated that it was illegal for an ex-slave to be unemployed. So they could be locked up for being unemployed. They could be sentenced, sent to prison, and they would be forced to work for the person who had reported them as being unemployed for the length of time that the judge had decided that they needed to work for that person. And I talk about that in my book. It can be found in my book. And the Black codes, and I grew up in North Carolina, so I'm not picking on North Carolina, but this is what I know, I focused on, I should say, because I grew up there.
Now
Because,
I live in North Carolina.
right, I know. But
When I lived in New York, I never felt that I was an Indian or I was different.
right.
When I came here to North Carolina, I experienced it firsthand. So yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Uh,
But North Carolina, for example, was one of those examples that I use in the book. I made a statement or from Section 2 of the Constitution of North Carolina, and it reads as follows. This is really important. all persons of color who are now inhabitants of this state shall be entitled to the same privileges and are subject to the same burdens and disabilities as by the laws of the state were conferred on or were attached to free persons of color prior to the ordinance of emancipation, except as the same may be changed by law. So what they were saying there is that their black codes took away the freedoms of the slaves and moved them back to the legal state that they were in prior to the emancipation, which was the passage of the 13th Amendment, which was slavery. So they simply passed a law to move them back into slavery. And I talked. I'm
Yes.
sorry.
And stay tuned. We're going to come back with some more of Jim Crow and listen to more from Lester Patrick. But in the meantime, we want you to get this book because it's a very important time in our lives. And we never thought we'd even use this word again. But it is coming up more and more into importance. And I'll tell you why it's coming to importance in a bit. But I'm going to stop the segment. All the video links will be in the YouTube description. Make sure you like and share and subscribe this episode. And if you buy his book, take a photo so that we know you're watching and you're supporting the channel, because one of the things that our authors like is if you buy the book. Now, we want to promote literacy. So we want you to read more, and we want you to start a library, and we want you to invest in books, because it's very important that we read more as a society and read about topics like Jim Crow and books like Lester's book. It's available on Amazon. It's available on his website. The website is exactly the same as the title of the book, Start Unapologetic Present. And it is also available at Barnes & Nobles and a number of stores. So you have no excuse. Get the book. You're watching Discover Brightside, and Lester, you've been discovered on Brightside. Thank you for watching. And I'm going to stop right here. Okay, that